For those of you who were here yesterday, you already can imagine what a treat we have in store. But if this is your first time among us to hear the deep, heartfelt, and challenging in a beautiful way words of Cole Arthur Riley, you are in for a treat indeed. Cole Arthur Riley is, as I mentioned yesterday, a sage, wise beyond her years, someone who shares her experience with deep grace and vulnerability, hailing from Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, now living in Ithaca, New York, and giving her gifts to the entire world through her Black Liturgies Instagram page, through her book, This Here Flesh, and with another book on the horizon, which will put in book form many of the meditations and prayers and thoughts that have been gracing us through social media with her Black Liturgies Instagram pages, and we are so excited for it. I do want to say a word just, if I would, that's a little beyond the introduction, because I recognize that having Cole speak with us at this time is the perfect moment for us to engage her words. We are a diocese that's growing deeply into becoming a place not of false belonging, but of real belonging. And the gift that she gave us yesterday was to do some deep-hearted work, both as individuals and as a whole diocese, to do that. She is a well-sought-after speaker across the Episcopal Church and beyond, across faith communities and those who are searching for faith. And I would say that we do have a prophet in our midst. It is, without further ado, and with great joy and delight, that I reintroduce to us Cole Arthur Riley.
Hello. Good morning. It's good to be with you all again. To begin, I want to take us to a scene. It's one of the passages of literature that has been kind of core in my own reclamation of the body and rest, and that is the clearing of Toni Morrison's novel, Beloved. So travel into that with me. Morrison writes, "When warm weather came, baby Suggs, holy, followed by every Black man, woman, and child who could make it through, took her great heart to the clearing. A wide open place cut deep in the woods, nobody knew for what, at the end of a path known only to deer and whoever cleared the land in the first place. In the heat of every Saturday afternoon, she sat in the clearing while the people waited among the trees, and after situating herself on a huge rock, baby Suggs bowed her head and prayed silently as the company watched from the trees. And they knew she was ready when she put her stick down," Morrison writes. So she puts her stick down and she says, "Let the children come." And the children all come from the perimeter of the clearing into the center. And she says, "Let your mothers hear you laugh." And the woods ring out with laughter, and the adults look on and can't help smiling. And then she says, "Let the grown men come." And the men step out, and one by one from the trees, and she says, "Let your wives and your children see you dance." So the men start to dance, and the ground kind of comes to life under their feet. And finally, she calls the woman to her. It says, "Woman, come." And she says, "Cry for the living and the dead, just cry." And the women begin to weep. And Morrison writes, it started like that, with the women weeping and the children laughing and the men dancing, until they all got kind of mixed up in one another, until the woman stopped crying and laughed. And the children began to dance, and the men sat down and began to cry. And so they participate in this emotional, embodied, intergenerational exchange until they collapse in the clearing, exhausted. And it's into this that Baby Suggs gives her sermon. And Morrison's very clear. She says, the matriarch, she doesn't just give this traditional gospel message. She says she doesn't tell them to go and sin no more. She says, in this here place, we have flesh that weeps, laughs, flesh that dances on bare feet in grass. Love it hard. She says, yonder, they do not love your flesh, they despise it. And they don't love your eyes, they just as soon pick them out. No more do they love the skin on your back, yonder they flay it. She says, oh, my people, they do not love your hands. Those they only use, tie, bind, chop off, or leave empty. Love your hands, love them, raise them up, kiss them, touch others with them, stroke them on your face, because they don't love that either. She says, this is flesh I'm talking about here. Flesh that needs to be loved, feet that need to rest and to dance, backs that need support, shoulders that need arms, strong arms, I'm telling you. She says, oh, my people, they do not love your neck, unnoosed and straight. So love your neck. Put a hand on it, stroke it. Hold it up and all your inside parts that they just as soon slop for hogs. Just gotta love them. This is the prize. What is at stake in a disembodied life? So in recent years, there's been this notable increase in calls to pay attention to our bodies. You see this a lot among wellness influencers and the kind of vacuum that is self-care propaganda at the moment. You'll hear, listen to your body, rest, take care of yourself. And the message is often valid and necessary, but the why and the how have become, in my opinion, cheapened by a society that equates caring for the body with buying bath bombs and going to luxury vacations, which there's nothing wrong with those things. I don't mind those things, but I begin at the site of the clearing because I have to be clear that when I'm talking about reclaiming the body, when I'm talking about rest and breath, I'm talking raw, earthy, desperate, deeply enfleshed dignity of our bodies and the world around us. The clearing that Morrison offers up in Beloved reminds us that to survive, we must locate a spirituality that has just as much to do with the corporeal as it does with one's interior life. This is my belief, that the physical is the spiritual. I think they cannot be divorced from one another. And any attempt to do so is kind of our society's very strategic reprogramming. Our society, rife with exhaustion, enslaved by capitalism, addicted to technology, and poorly equipped to care for the traumatized, I think is perpetually training us toward a different path. Endless cues of self-hatred, hatred of the body. From the time we're quite little, you hear rub some dirt in it, right? Mind over matter. Don't give up, never quit. All of these can be perceived as these messages of integrity. When the reality is, I think we've all known what it is to give far too much, to ask far too much of our bodies. And it's not the voice of tenderness, of stillness, of self-compassion that rises to meet us. Instead, it's these mantras, violent mantras in the end, because they communicate that it's better, that it's somehow more honorable for you to forget your body, usually so that you can produce more for a society that does not care about you. But that it's better to forget our bodies than to listen to them, than to tend to them. So if you hear a little else as I speak this morning, I'd want you to hear this. If you aren't in your body, someone else is. I believe this. If you aren't in your body, someone else is. Morrison writes, love your neck. They do not love to see your neck unnoosed and straight. With every call to attune to the physical, to love the flesh, Baby Suggs is reminding them what is lurking beyond the clearing. A world that does not care for Black bodies, for disabled bodies, for bodies disinterested in being ground up and spit out on the altars of productivity and utility. The call to stay in your body begins to ring a little more urgent when you realize that to be absent from the body, it's not like departing and leaving the body alone. It's, if you aren't in your body, someone else is. It's not a void, it's an open door. There are systems that have everything to gain from our disembodiment because emptied bodies are easier to use. I find it so fascinating that for a faith that in its holy text puts so much emphasis on the body that we are trained to neglect it. These are the stories that hold together the Christian traditions, okay? You have a God who walks in the garden with his creation. You have the fall leading to the entrance of shame at the sight of Adam and Eve's bodies. Of course, you have, this is my body, this is my blood, eat, drink, in the Eucharistic traditions. You have God born into a body, God relying on a body. If you were someone that believes Mary carried the Christ, was the mother of the Christ, what you're saying is that you believe that God put their faith in a woman's body, that God drank from the breast of their creation. These are the stories that hold together the Christian tradition. And it beats blood, right? And yet, too often, we are taught to sacrifice our bodies for God, to be used by God. How is God going to use you? We're taught to be used by God far more than we're taught to lie down by still waters, to eat, drink, to rest in the valley of the shadow of death. I think we've erected this delusion that the important things are the invisible things, and our task is to resist this formation, to resist and take hold of the inherent beauty and dignity of the physical, though it's not an easy task in a traumatized world. So more and more research is being released on the long-term and even inherited effects of traumatic experiences on a person's body. I want to share with you a quote from Gabor Mate. He's a Hungarian physician and author who writes, "In the absence of relief, a young person's natural response, their only response really, is to repress and disconnect from the feeling states associated with suffering. One no longer knows one's body." And he says, oddly, this self-estrangement can show up later in life in the form of apparent strength, such as my ability to perform at a high level when hungry or stressed or fatigued, pushing on without awareness of my need for pause, nutrition, or rest. Trauma in all its forms trains us toward disembodiment, dissociation, right? And in the immediacy of trauma, this is actually a biological mercy. There are times when leaving the body is a kind of salvation, a way for the body to distance itself from the present terror. But our task is to not become overly familiar with a disembodied existence. Because habitual disembodiment is not a mercy, it's a prison. I believe that. Now, as a Black woman in America, I have inherited a story of grave violence against the Black body. Perpetual neglect and alienation and dismissal of the Black body throughout American history. And from the time I was a little girl, I learned to divorce myself from my body in order to survive. This isn't unique to me. For many people of color, for many marginalized groups, other oppressed groups, we have had to forget our bodies, because to remember them is to subject yourself to the daily violence that the world heaps on us in their actions, beliefs, policies, and language. So I don't mean to say disembodiment is always our fault, but I'll say this: the work of service, of justice, of activism, of existing as marginalized people groups, it lands heavily on our bodies. Every time I have to say Black Lives Matter, it takes something from me, because I was never meant to need to convince anyone of my dignity. It's costly, exhausting. So in a world where we are forced to march to the rallying cry of "I can't breathe," when we're forced to hear Black people call out for their moms and their makers, with their last words being "I can't breathe," what does it mean to reclaim our breath? To reclaim our bodies. It's not just kind of wellness, self-help fluff. This is profound resistance, liberation for those of us whose collective breath has been stolen, whose bodies have been degraded. When I pause to practice breath prayer, it's a reclamation. It's a reminder that my breath is actually worthy to be nurtured, not stolen. When I breathe, I breathe for my grandma and my grandma's grandma. When I listen to my body and I lie down to rest, I do so for my ancestors who couldn't, who didn't have agency in their bodies. So this is what I haven't told you. I was 26 when I became sick. It started with something like the flu, and then led to a pain in my left shoulder, and then my left arm, and then my other arm, my hands, my cervical spine, until all of a sudden my husband was feeding me my food and tying my shoes in secret. And I was left to occupy a body that felt like a stranger to me. So at its worst, I was tethered to my bed for almost a year. I would maybe leave to go to a meeting, but then come right back home and get into bed. Some of you know this. Some of you know this ritual. And I would just lie there, as still as ice on my back, not wanting to disturb anything. But in a time when my body needed compassion and patience and tenderness, I did precisely the same thing that the world does to Black bodies, disabled bodies. Okay, I turned against it. I thought, if I can't have dignity in the body, I'll at least have it in my mind. So I retreated again into books, into documentaries. And at this point, there were very little answers about what was happening to my body. I was being poked and prodded, neurologists, rheumatologists, speech and swallow therapists, and running test after test. And in the absence of answers, and in the confines of a body that didn't feel like my own, I learned to escape it. Traumatized people, chronically feel unsafe inside their bodies. I didn't just feel unsafe, I was terrified, and I turned that terror against the body. In her book, The Body is Not an Apology, Sonia Renee Taylor, she writes, "Body terrorism is a hideous tower whose primary support beam is the belief that there is a hierarchy of bodies. We uphold the system by internalizing this hierarchy and using it to situate our own value and worth in the world." She also writes, "Living in a society structured to profit from our self-hate creates a dynamic in which we are so terrified of being ourselves that we adopt terror-based ways of being in our bodies." So I adopted a terror-based way of occupying my body. And along the way, I realized that I had been neglecting the physical, meals, rest. I'd been neglecting the physical long before I became sick. You know, as a Black woman, I escaped my body to avoid the violence of a world bent on anti-Blackness. As a queer woman, you know, I escaped my body to kind of avoid the ingrained homophobia that told me I was dirty. And as a child who felt that profound sense of loneliness, I distanced myself from my body to survive the rejection of it. So fast forward about a year after I first became sick, maybe a year and a half, I was at the Cleveland Clinic with doctors doing more tests, more poking, and I was released the day before my husband and I were supposed to go to Paris. We didn't think we were going to be able to go. It was released unexpectedly the day before. We thought, you know, when the chance comes, just go to Paris. So we did, probably unwisely, because as we traveled, my condition continued to deteriorate. By the time we arrived, I was needing a wheelchair to get around most places, which a wheelchair is not all that conducive to like the cobblestone streets of Paris where we were staying. So I ended up spending 3 or 4 days of that trip in bed. You know, I would say I came to Paris to just sleep in someone else's bed. And on one morning, I was in a particularly desperate state. So this was the beginning of issues with my legs, which was quite scary, and the beginning of some of the issues with my eyes. My husband had left to go get espresso or croissants or something, and I was back at the Airbnb again and feeling a kind of despair, a kind of fear, and I began to pray out loud, which I don't typically do, ever, really. I don't think I have since, not organically. I might, you know, pray something written. I'm from an Episcopal church, and so if I pray, it's words written typically. But I was feeling desperate. It was kind of like a more begging than praying. I began to pray out loud, and because it was out loud, it was the first time I was hearing my own interior world so clearly, turned against my physical self with the venom, with the disgust, with the hatred that was so unavoidable. I'll spare you the expletives, but you know, God, just save me from these expletive hands, you know, these worthless legs. And it was the first time because it was out loud, I was really confronted with it. And I was hearing, oh, this is what is really in you, against you. And something in me kind of rose up in defense of me. And I remember just stopping mid-sentence, you know, just mid-sentence stopping. And I began to pass the peace around my body. Now passing the peace, you all know this kind of gesture. You say peace, peace, and you shake each other's hands in a liturgical service. And it's kind of been reduced to like a greeting in some spaces. But I think the position in the liturgy is actually really beautiful. You know, a moment of reconciliation, a way to turn to your neighbor and say, peace, I'm right by you, you're right by me. You know, peace, peace, before you approach the altar and kind of receive the liberation of the Eucharist together. It's a beautiful kind of gesture. I began to pass the peace around my body. I remember kind of flexing my hands, peace, wiggling my toes, peace, and putting my eyelashes to the back of my hand, peace. And the beautiful thing about this is it wasn't really a cognitive decision. I didn't think to myself, oh, there's this, you know, very old liturgical tradition where you turn to your neighbor and you do peace, and this is going to mean, it didn't occur to me. It was almost instinctual, a bodily instinct. I began to pass the peace, and the meaning of it, I think, has only occurred to me in memory, the deeper meaning. And I wasn't healed. Things got a lot worse before they got better. And still, I've known no greater reconciliation to date. Reconciliation with the self, with the flesh. I made a kind of vow on that bed in Paris that I will not abandon my body. I will not. You know, our task is to remain in our bodies, in all their mystery, their pain, their alienation. What would it mean to stay close to yourself? We are tired. There are people in this room, I think, who are in a pain in the body that they don't even have the language for. I think there are those of us who wake daily with an interior fatigue that feels relentless. We are tired. What could it mean to encounter the divine who says no? Peace, rest, to lay hold of a spiritual praxis that says no, stop, lie down. This is how we'll recall our dignity. This is how. What is at stake in a disembodied life? No less than our complete and collective liberation. Thank you.